Okay, I would now like to invite Dr. John Vallance, the State Librarian, to welcome you to the library today. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thanks so much, Ellen. And the very warmest of welcomes to the State Library. As Ellen just said, I'm John Vallance. I've been State Librarian for 18 months and I am learning a huge amount very, very quickly. One of the first things I discovered here is that there's an expectation that all public events start with an acknowledgement of country. And sometimes I used to think initially that this was really just almost a sort of platitudinous nod in the direction of something that was really, really important, but whose importance was not quite grasped. And the public library experience has actually taught me, more than anything else really, just how important it is. I've seen firsthand, for example, in South Tamworth, in Condobolin, the extent of the contribution that Indigenous front desk staff are making in public libraries. I'm constantly astonished at just how vibrant Indigenous culture is in New South Wales. Paul Irish wrote a book about this experience in the Sydney area a few years ago called Hidden in Plain View. And so when I start by acknowledging that we're on Gadigal land and acknowledging elders past, present and emerging, that isn't just some kind of anodyne form of words. It's also an acknowledgement that the public library network across the state is playing a very, very important part in the maintenance, the continued vibrancy of Indigenous Aboriginal culture. So that's a very important thing with which to start. This year we're celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Library Act, which was passed in 1939. I think it's one of the most important pieces of civil legislation in New South Wales legal history. The anniversary, I think, comes in early November. And I want to have some kind of party going across all public libraries in New South Wales so we can reflect on just how important the public library is today. I can remember in another life, I was an academic back in the early 1990s, and in my university there was a conversation about the future of libraries. It was the very early days of the World Wide Web, and our governing body had to decide whether or not to invest in building a new library or going digital. And they were on the edge of going digital. They came so close to deciding not to build a new library, but in the end they did build a new library, and that new library is now open 24 hours a day. It never closes. And all of those people, all those years ago, who said that we were only going to read online have been proven wrong. The fact is that we're going through a revolution that Caxton and Gutenberg could only have dreamt of. We don't yet really know where it is, but in libraries we have to provide everything. The book was never going to die. The book is very much alive, but we're going to hear a lot about ebooks this morning. One of the big challenges that I face here, we spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on subscriptions for e-journals, e-books and so on, yet we haven't yet found a way effectively of making them properly visible through our catalogue service. We provide free access to all of your libraries to our online journals. It's worth a huge amount to readers, but most of them don't know about it. It's very, very difficult. We haven't yet found ways of communicating the riches that we have in our collections to our readers. We have new generations who are brought up on Google, companies like Google that do nothing but develop search technology. It seems to me has gone way beyond traditional library catalogues. You can misspell some very vague search query into Google, and you can get a whole series of quite plausible and useful answers. But if you type something into the State Library catalogue, it's like playing Russian roulette. You may or may not find something. I play this game all the time, trying to find things in our catalogue. And sometimes I think it's one of the biggest operational challenges that I face as State Librarian, that our catalogue in many ways is like a piece of armour-plated glass between the reader and the collection. And it's a really, really big challenge. It's also an exciting time to be in libraries because they're changing so quickly. We're reading a lot about the so-called glam sector, and in particular about museums. But I think libraries have been really, really successful in adapting to changes in communities, especially in non-metropolitan areas. One of the things that I love most about my job is the public library visits out in regional New South Wales. And in parts of the state where in another generation the social focus might have been the bank manager's office or the lawyer's office or the pub or church, the library is increasingly the one place where absolutely anyone is welcome. Absolutely anyone, regardless of background, can be expected to be safe and treated with respect. And it's very, very difficult to overstate the importance of that. And I think that our politicians are gradually waking up to the fact that libraries are an absolutely critical part of the social infrastructure, the community infrastructure of our state. That's something that the current government of New South Wales began to acknowledge last year when they agreed to pump that extra $60 million into the public library network over the next 4 years. And we have to keep the pressure on them to make sure that that commitment is not only honoured after that 4-year period, but is built on, because we've got quite a lot to catch up on. One of the things that I love about this group is that it's a reader advisory group. I don't really like the way that libraries sometimes call people who use them clients. Lawyers have clients, prostitutes have clients, and libraries have readers and visitors. And I was really encouraged to see that this was called a reader advisory group. It could also be, I suppose, called a visitor advisory group. I remember going to Kingscliff, south of Tweed Heads last year, and for the first time I saw a seed library. You don't have to borrow books from libraries. You borrow seeds and then you grow them in your garden and then you return the seeds. I thought that was fantastic. In Tamworth, I saw a pots and pans library. If you're going to have lots of people around for dinner, you can go to the library and not just borrow cookery books, but you can actually borrow the sort of kitchen equipment that you wouldn't normally have if you're catering for large numbers of people. Being a kind of white bread bloke, I'd love to see tool libraries started, so you can go and borrow screwdrivers and electric drills and things like that. But it's just one example of the way that libraries very subtly are responding to the needs of communities. I was out in Condobolin last year. Teresa Judge invited us out there. And I was astonished at how many people gathered in this little library on the edge of a fairly remote country town. You got a sense of just how important it was. The decline of TAFE in other parts of the state. Libraries have stepped in to offer courses to fill the void there. That was very noticeable, I saw in parks. It's very, very exciting what's going on. So I know that this group has concentrated on different things in the past, on romantic fiction. I loved the way that you have not that narrow idea of what reference material constitutes. Everything is reference material if you refer to it. And I've learned in the last 18 months about genres, literary genres I never knew existed. You know, I knew about chick lit, but I didn't know about chook lit. And in Walker Library, I forgot about this, but I found it on my phone this morning. I came across a Mills and Boon book called The Brooding Surgeon's Baby Bombshell. I think it's just fantastic. I mean, and I know that you're going to have a particular focus today on science fiction. But the important thing is I'm delighted you're here. I know that the contribution you make at the front line is one of the most important social contributions that's being made in communities across New South Wales. I'm delighted that you're focused on the experience of readers. And if you can do anything to help make things more readily findable, not just in your own library networks, but here as well, then I will be very much in your debt. I think that Kim is going to speak. Am I introducing you, Kim? No, I'm not introducing. No. There's some things I'm just not trusted with. But you've got a very, very distinguished lineup of people, starting with Professor Kimberly Weatherall from the University of Sydney. You've got authors, you've got booksellers. I think you've got some people from Kinnakunya. More proof that the bookshop is not dead. It's a really exciting time to be working in libraries, and I hope you have a very productive day.
Thank you very much, John. That was a fabulous introduction to the day. Now, I've just realised I haven't got the screen here quite right. I would like to introduce Kimberly Weatherall, who is a Professor of Law at the University of Sydney. I have to say thanks very much to Ross Balharry, my colleague in New South Wales Net, for this connection. Kimberly is the editor with Dr. Rebecca Giblin of What If We Could Reimagine Copyright? And can I say, do have a look at that book, because it explores the goals of copyright law and how they might be better achieved if copyright was redesigned. But today we're mainly hearing about some of her ARC-funded projects, including one grant which is on the availability and use of ebooks in Australian public libraries. Please welcome Professor Kimberly Weatherall.
So is that a bit nice and neat? It seems to come up in that.
And just a quick word for those online, if you could mute your microphones, that would be fabulous. Thanks very much.
So it's a real honour to be here today. Thank you for inviting me along. I'm here to talk about ebooks, as Ellen mentioned, and in particular how accessible they are to public libraries, what public libraries can get hold of, whether it makes sense for public libraries to have ebooks in their collection, and this project that we've been doing, funded by the Australian Government and with library partners, looking at all these questions in a really deep way. The reason we started to look at this, my background is copyright. Mostly I'm an IP lawyer and professor. And one of the interesting things about ebooks versus physical books is the completely different way they're regulated when it comes to what libraries can do. Right? A library can go and buy a book and do what it likes with it. Right? Lend it out as many times as it likes, repair it as many times as it likes, decide to sell it on, decide to keep it. Ebooks are really different. Because of the way copyright law works, publishers basically get to control how ebooks are licensed. And what that means is that publishers have unprecedented rights of control. They have exercised those in some really interesting ways. So, for example, requiring libraries to buy 1,000 books if they want access to one, or refusing to allow their books to be available as ebooks for e-lending at all. And that raises some really important questions for libraries. We've already heard referred to the fact that people may be taking a while to realise that public libraries have ebooks. But in our view, when we started this, it's quite important that libraries be able to do ebooks and e-lending, because there's whole populations of people who don't walk into libraries, can't walk into libraries at the hours that they're open, and ebooks makes things available to them. People who are far away from their local libraries. So we decided to try and figure out what was actually happening in this space. This is the team. This is my research team. And it includes academics from a whole range of disciplines. So we have some data scientists, because they're really good at getting a lot of data for us and helping us analyse it. We have communications and media scholars, so we can work out what the data means and what it means for people's behaviour and how it changes what libraries are doing. And we've got people like me who are experts in law, so we can work out what to do about it, whether law or policy needs to change, whether copyright law, for example, might need to change. Importantly too, we couldn't be doing this project without an immense network of library partners. So the State Library of New South Wales has been working with us, but you can see there we've got state libraries from elsewhere across the nation. We've got local libraries like Yarra Plenty. We've got libraries all over the world. So we've got libraries in America, in New Zealand, in Canada. The Vancouver Public Library has been working with us to try and get a sense of what's happening in Australia and how it compares to what's happening in other countries as well. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of our findings, and then talk about what we're doing next, what you might be interested in following as we go along. Now, the first thing I want to do is just talk about the landscape, how all of this works. So, how does a book get from the author to an ebook that a reader can borrow from their library catalogue? The author licenses, as we know, their books to publishers and distributors, but those publishers and distributors license their books to the aggregators. Aggregators are kind of like the Netflix or the Apple Music of the ebook lending world. So they get books from all the different publishers and then make their books available via a platform to libraries. And libraries then choose which books from the platform they want to make available to their readers and pay for that, and then the readers can get access via the catalogue. So libraries pay both a platform fee to each of the aggregators that they do business with, and they also pay per book they want to make available to libraries. So the price of books matters a lot, and the terms on which books matters a lot to whether libraries can offer much of an ebook collection. And that's what we were interested in exploring. How much, what's available. It's worth noting at the start, just because I've been asked about this before, we were focused on ebooks in public libraries, so not audiobooks. Important as they are, and we know they're really important, it's as researchers, it's only possible to do a few things at once. So we did these studies. The first couple of studies we did were really focused ones. We curated a list of about 550 books that we thought would be interesting to people. It's a combination of prize winners, and prize winners across genres, everything from Australian fiction, science fiction, to the romance, youth fiction, non-fiction. So we got a series of prizes, and then we also looked at bestsellers. So we've got a combination of popular and prize winners, and of course the books that are both. We looked at each of the aggregators across that operate in the Australian market, the major 5 aggregators, some of which you might recognise if you've used an ebook yourself. By the way, how many people have used ebooks or borrowed? Now, you see, this is an informed audience, isn't it? You need to tell all your friends that you can get ebooks in public libraries, and John has already made that point. But you would be surprised how often I talk about this research and people say, you can borrow ebooks from the public library? Right, so we looked at each of the 5 aggregators, and we looked at what books could the aggregators get hold of as ebooks, how much they cost, and the terms on which they're made available to libraries. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So this is the Australian study. And then we also wanted to look at how their position in Australia might compare to other Anglophone countries. And so we looked at 5 different jurisdictions. As you can see there, Australia, New Zealand, US, Canada, and the UK. Same titles, 1 aggregator this time because they operate in all of the markets. And we asked those same questions. So we could look at, whether we're better off here in Australia than other countries, or worse off perhaps, or whether the libraries are getting different deals. And then, because we have data scientists involved in the project and because they thought 546 titles wasn't big enough, we decided to do about 100,000 titles, 380,000 different licenses. So this is, one aggregator, the 5 jurisdictions, but a much bigger number of titles. So we can be we can do a more fine-grained analysis and be really confident about the results. Now, obviously, we didn't sit down and work out the most popular 100,000 books that people might be interested in. So we did this bit a little bit differently. Because of the help of our library partners, we were able to create what's called our checkouts database. This is every overdrive checkout ever across those different jurisdictions. Don't worry, it's all anonymised. I can't look at what you individually borrowed, of course. And of course, we got ethics approval and we're supervised by ethics committees. So we're not invading people's privacy. But what we were able to do was look at this, and I mean, that's a lot of loans, right? That's 7.6 million borrows of titles from a whole lot of different borrowers, a whole lot of different publishers, 2006 through to 2017. And what we did was we took those and we worked out which authors were the most borrowed, and then we looked at their books for that 100,000 sample. By the way, we were also able to work out that the typical ebook is borrowed 6 times a year, or 13 times in total. Now, keep those numbers in mind because it's kind of interesting when we get to some of the next bits. All right. One last thing before I get into some of the results is the licenses. Basically, there were 2 kinds of licenses that libraries could get. One is quite a lot like what you'd get if you had a physical book. That's the one copy, one user. So only one person can borrow the book at a time, but the library has access to that book as long as they have access to the platform. So it doesn't disappear. That's the better version, although you might think, well, it's a bit of a shame that we only let one person borrow at a time because digital, and if it's popular, there's no reason why we should limit it that way, except that the publishers want it limited that way. The other kind of license, though, is the metered access. These are the ones that are limited to one person at a time still, but also limited in the sense that they're restricted by time or number of loans or both. So you might get the ones we particularly focused on was what we call the exploding licenses. So these are the ones that will be deleted from a library's collection as soon as either the term is up, so 2 years, or the number of loans has been done. So maybe you get 24 loans or 2 years, whichever expires first. And we call those exploding, and we don't like them much because it could mean that a library's paid for a book that never gets borrowed, disappears after 2 years. Or they're paid for a book and it gets, borrowed continually and then it disappears before the 2 years is up. So, and that can be quite an expensive proposition for a library, right? If it's paying $20 and that book never gets borrowed and then it's being asked to pay again in 2 years' time, that could become quite an expensive book. So, what did we find? 5 key findings. One is that books are missing. Right? If you look at the focused study that we did, this is the percentage of books in our list of 550 odd, and these are prize winners and bestseller books, ones that the libraries could not find to lend out. They weren't available on any platform. Okay? So, the good news is that 60% odd of books were available, which is good. And actually higher than we were expecting, but there's a lot of books that are missing. So internationally, if you look at the focused international one study, Australia, about 30% of the books were missing. That's about as good as it got. You don't want to be in the UK, apparently. Right? They have less books available to them. Not available as ebooks. Not available as ebooks. We did, of course, compare this to whether you could buy the book physically. 6% of the books in our list, and our list goes back quite a long way into sort of backlist and older books. So 6% of them you couldn't buy physically, and then somewhere between 29 and 40% you couldn't get as an ebook. So physical availability was better. When we looked at the bigger study, we found that actually the picture gets a little bit more interesting because now you can see that in fact access isn't the same around the world. So Canada and the US, most books were available. There were only 12% of our 100K titles that they couldn't get as ebooks. But it was more like 20% in Australia and New Zealand. And by the way, it's important to realise that these are decisions made by the publishers, not the aggregators. The aggregators, for the most part, will take everything they can get. It's interesting too to look at the difference between publishers. This was a particularly shocking statistic to us. Hachette is the world's third largest trade and educational publisher, right? And in our focused study, we found massive difference, right? So in America, 90% of the Hachette titles are available. In Australia and the UK, 3 or 4%. So basically, Hachette is not licensing to Australia and New Zealand. It was even worse in the large-scale study, right? So of our 100,000 titles, US, you could get about 1,500, Canada 1,300. In Australia and the UK and New Zealand, there was a total of 16 Hachette titles that were available. Now, and that's because Hachette's various offices have different policies across the world. In Commonwealth countries, they're just refusing to make their catalogue available. In fact, the 16 that we did find was from an imprint that had recently been acquired by Hachette, so we suspect that they won't be around for long if they maintain their standard policy. So this isn't great. I present this to academics and it's like, don't publish with Hachette. You want your stuff to be available. All right. That said, there were some good signs. I mean, I've already highlighted that, in fact, over 60% of the titles were available as ebooks. This is not what we'd heard when we originally started the project. So that was good news. And another thing was that we did find that of those 6% of books that were not available physically, half of those you could get as an ebook. So in fact, ebooks were contributing to cultural availability of books that had gone out of print. And that's a really positive sign, because that's exactly what ebooks should be doing. If it's no longer viable to have the physical book available for purchase, there's not necessarily any reason not to keep it available digitally. Another good piece of good news, I guess, is that we were expecting to see a lot less availability going back in time. So we thought the more recent books that had been effectively born digital, made in the digital era, would be more likely to be available as ebooks from the aggregators. But you'll see there that actually the peak availability was around the year 2000, so I guess that is digital, but it's not brand new. And there was quite a lot of, over 50% of our books back in the kind of 1920s, 1960s, 1970s were available as ebooks. So publishers have gone back and made those older books, at least from the authors that are most frequently borrowed, available as ebooks. So that is also very good news. So even those 1980s, 1990s titles were available to libraries at above 65%, which is important, I think, because again, libraries play a really important role in making sure that books that have disappeared off the bookstore shelves remain available to people. You probably know that books have a commercial life of less than 2 years on the books in most bookstores. But an important thing that we have found is that even when the books are available in theory for libraries to get, they're actually not available on terms that would make sense for libraries to acquire them. So that's what I mean when they say they're not necessarily accessible, in the sense that they're not offered on terms that libraries could justify. So we know, of course, that books depreciate really quickly, right? Almost all books have a commercial life of less than 5 years, and many it's even shorter. And so you would expect that there would be lower demand for older books, including in libraries, and that the terms on which they would be offered would reflect that. So you'd expect older books, like the physical older books, would be cheaper over time, right? Not so much. Right? Firstly, if you look at the license type. Now, you remember I talked about the metered terms versus the one copy, one user, you get to keep it forever terms. Right? I would have expected, again, that one copy, one user that doesn't expire after 2 years, for example, would increase over time. We would expect to see more of the older books available OCOU. And of course, we do get a little peek. Those are the books that are in the public domain. Right? That's where copyright has expired and suddenly everything becomes significantly cheaper. But for the rest of that period, the period I've got that box around, it's pretty much static. Right? And a lot of those books, you know, we're talking sort of 30%-ish, are metered by time. That means the library has to rebuy it every 2 years, even if it's not being borrowed. Right? Which doesn't necessarily make sense for a library. We also looked at the price over time. And this slide shows the prices of the OCOU licenses. And this is from the big study, right? So, you know, 250,000 odd licenses, charted by publication date over time. So again, so this is price. So again, you can see that price is nice and low in the public domain period where there isn't copyright in the book. And then it goes up. And it goes up, so they're sort of hovering around $2.50, which is great. But then you see a jump to between $10 and $20 for the in-copyright books. And the price actually peaks between the 1930s and the 1970s. So that's the more expensive books. And then for books published more recently, the prices actually trend lower, which doesn't make all that much sense to me at all. So what we're seeing here in the figures is that not a lot of correspondence between what you'd expect of, you know, demand and price and demand. Some of the less in-demand books are more expensive, and that's why I say they're not accessible to libraries. It doesn't make sense for a library to be purchasing those books for their people, which means that those older books won't be as available, we would expect. Libraries told us that it was important to have license choice so they could make decisions about their budget, whether they wanted to purchase a book on an OCOU basis for a bit more money or a metered basis. Most titles, libraries have no choice. If it's metered access, it's metered access, and you can't pay a little bit more to get it forever, which again would enable libraries to kind of act to curate their collections. So all of this kind of explains what I mean when I say that books are available without necessarily being accessible. Licensing and pricing for older books doesn't reflect their likely lower demand and makes it infeasible for libraries to collect them. And that threatens libraries' role in making sure that older books are available to people. We did do a little bit more complicated machine learning data science to try and work out what determined the price and terms on which a book was offered. Basically, it has nothing to do with age, it has nothing to do with likely demand, it has everything to do with the publisher. The publisher is determining the terms. One final lesson that we got from doing this study was that there's a really strong case for transparency here. And there's evidence that even the publishers and aggregators don't know what's going on in this market. Because we were told, when we were designing our study originally, in particular the focus study, we wanted to look at price and variation in price. This was a little bit sensitive, as you can imagine, for aggregators giving us access to that data. And they kind of told us there was no point, because every aggregator would have the same price because that's what the publishers told them would be true. So we were told, don't bother, you don't need to collect that information. You can see where I'm going with this, right? There was quite a lot of difference, actually, in terms and price. So for 41% of our focus study titles, there was a difference. There was at least one difference in licensing terms across the platforms. So and 22% of those were major differences. So, one platform would have it OCOU and the other one would have it metered. So actually it does matter which platform something is on, which again surprised us because we were told that wouldn't happen. What that suggests to us, by the way, is not some sort of weird nefariousness. It's that publishers actually just aren't good at this. They don't necessarily do what they say they're doing, which is offering the same terms, right? So aggregators who thought they were getting the same terms often found they weren't. One aggregator, actually, we showed these results to aggregators, and one aggregator wrote back to us and said, well, your results must be completely wrong because this particular publisher you have them as OCOU and they're not. They moved to metered access ages ago. And we looked into it and we found the terms had changed for 4 aggregators, but not for the other aggregator. And it had taken 5 years for the publisher to roll out the change of terms for that particular aggregator. We think it was just they probably just overlooked it. They don't have a good sense of what's going on themselves. So even if publishers intend aggregators to be the same, they're not always good at doing that. By the way, pricing was all over the shop as well. So prices did differ across different platforms. Right? And you can see that that at least a not insignificant proportion had kind of differences of 50% and above. That's the red slice there. And this highlights how difficult it must be for libraries to make decisions and make purchasing decisions. So we say there should be a lot more transparency. But this is a hard area for libraries, we think. This is a summary of our findings. Books are missing, but we were pleased to see, again, above 60% availability in most cases, that older books were available when we thought they might not be. In a separate study, we also have found that there was less of a delay in getting bestsellers available in ebook form than we thought there would be. I don't have the graphs here today, but if you're interested, ping me and we can show you that paper as well. But we found that the terms on which these are being made available don't make sense at all, and that suggests that there is a problem for libraries here. It doesn't surprise me to hear that there's a lot spent on ebooks that may not be borrowed, and I think that's a real challenge for libraries. So we're hoping to help now move on and think about how we might change law, policy to make this picture better for libraries. That's the next stage of our research. At the moment, we're analysing a survey we did of libraries to see how all of these things might impact on library decision making. So we get a better sense of what all of what I've showed you here means for libraries in practice. And we're analysing that now. We've had a terrific response from the libraries, who have been amazing partners as usual. And then we're also, as I say, going to do a bit of the law work. This is the bit where I get excited. Should there be more of an intervention? Do we need to change copyright? Do we need to change the public lending right? At the moment, are you familiar with the public lending right? So this is the payment that Australian authors get for books that are held in libraries physically. It doesn't apply for electronic books. Right. That applies to physical books, not ebooks. Now, in theory, of course, because ebooks is licensed, and in theory, you would expect that authors would get a share, but we're kind of investigating those questions too. How does all of this impact and all of this change impact on authors? There's been a lot of discussion about whether we should have a kind of electronic public lending right. Hopefully this data will help inform that debate, because of course we care about whether Australian authors are able to support their writing and contribute to Australian culture. So we are working with the PLR team in the Department of Communication and the Arts, and we've actually just recruited a terrific PhD student to look into all of these questions. So hopefully we'll solve that problem too. So that's everything I wanted to tell you. That's some of our results. This is a really important area for libraries. As I say, I do emphasise to you, do tell everyone that the ebooks are there. Because what we're seeing here is that the terms aren't necessarily great for libraries. It's really important that we use this resource so that libraries continue to invest in ebooks, and so we can make a case that this does matter and that, you know, companies like Hachette should change their practice. So thank you.
Are there any questions? And I'll be microphone runner. So stick, yep. No, people online won't.
Online. While she's running up, I will point out we've got a website here, and we actually put all the data up there, and our terrific data scientists created like data visualizations you can play with. So you can see, like, you know, you can look at just the older books or just the books of a particular publisher or just Australia, and there are tutorials on how to do it. So if you're interested, if you're a data nerd, check it out.
Do you see a way forward for publishers to get rid of the middleman, take out the aggregator and start their own publishing platform like what Disney's doing with Netflix?
It's interesting. I mean, the model has been completely different here. And I think the book publishers probably did learn quite a lot from the way that, well, you know, what happened with music in effect and what happened with iTunes. The decision they seem to have made is to allow lots of aggregators and give them all what they intend to be the same terms and same prices for books. I mean, I don't...
That's just business, isn't it? Like, you're not paying authors a flat rate. Some authors get a higher royalty rate than others. Wouldn't that be factored into the cost? Would that possibly explain why books from the 70s and earlier get a higher cost than, say, books in the noughties? Because when their publishing deals were done, or they're popular authors, they deserve or demand a higher royalty compared to authors in the early noughties who had digital deals maybe factored into their publishing.
I'm sure that's part of the reason why some of the, I mean, again, in theory, I'm sure that's why some of it, I mean, we don't, one thing we're not able to investigate in a really detailed way is why some of these pricing decisions are made by publishers. So we don't have access to all of the contracts, we don't have access to those terms. And we don't have access to things like, you know, potential costs. It may have cost money to digitise some of the older books, whereas that cost wouldn't have been there for the books that were born digital or has already been born in other deals, or other management of it. One thing that my co-investigator on this project, one of my co-investigators, Rebecca Giblin, is looking into is those questions of authors and how authors are remunerated for books, in effect. And so we will probably know more over the next couple of years about whether that is, in fact, a justification for some of this. So her project, The Author's Interest, if you're interested in following those questions about how authors do in the publishing market, The Author's Interest is another academic project, another data-informed one that Rebecca's running. So look, you know, yes, it is just business. But again, we think it's worth investigating this because, again, when you see differences from country to country, when you see significant differences in terms that are being offered country to country, and there are significant differences in the terms that you see in, say, the US and Canada and Australia and the Commonwealth, we think there's a genuine question there about whether we here have the regulatory settings right to get the best access for libraries. And if nothing else, if libraries have the information about what's available in other countries and the terms, we're hoping that libraries and library organisations can start asking some harder questions of some of the publishers, for example, in those forums where these questions around ebooks and e-lending are being discussed at an international level. And so we've talked to, for example, the International Federation of Library Associations and talked to them about their data, and that, you know, they're then able to use some of this data in their discussions, just basically to make sure that we're getting the right deal for the public and the right deal to ensure that libraries can continue to play the important cultural role that they have.
Thanks.
And for those of you online, if you put your questions on chat, I'll stop the screen sharing and we'll actually be able to read them shortly. But I've got a couple of questions here. One over on this side first, then I'll come back to the middle. Two in the middle. Oh, and it would be helpful if you said your name and your library, please. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier.
Hi, I'm Cheryl from Riverview Library Service. Are you intending to roll out this day to e-audiobooks?
The question we always get. We would love to, but the funding for this project was for ebooks and for this project. And whether it is worth doing a whole new project and the grant application process for audiobooks, I guess will be a decision for libraries and us to think about. So no current plans because it's not within the scope of this project. If libraries think it's important enough, I'm sure they'll come to us.
My name is Rose from the Senate. My question is, do you see the future library being more digital than in the future instead of more physical books? So would you see a lot, because being digital, there will be not many people walking into the library. They can just download wherever they are.
Look, I think that's a really interesting question. It's something that some of the survey material we've asked of, because I'm not an expert, I guess, in how your readers, and libraries' readers interact with their libraries. I mean, I think one thing, one thing that is interesting to think about here is whether the digital library means that the library serves a whole lot of different publics than the ones who are the publics who can and do walk into libraries. I mean, I know as someone who works full-time in a university that, I made massive use of my public library when my child was under school age and I had days at home and we would go to the library. I now use e-lending because I cannot physically get to a library most of the time in the periods when they're open. So I certainly don't see libraries as physical spaces being downgraded in importance. But I think that's partly because libraries have responded to a changing environment by doing all sorts of interesting things in libraries and being the kind of community hub that we don't otherwise have in our society at the moment. So my personal view, and this is not informed by this data because we haven't researched this question in detail, at least at the moment, is that I suspect that it is serving different publics, the ones who wouldn't otherwise have access. But there's one interesting thing we have is we do have this checkouts database. We're hoping that there'll be more research with that. We've been talking to a bunch of researchers to look in a little bit more detail about how ebooks are being used by readers. There's lots of rich data there to explore.
Hi, I'm Suzanne from Parramatta as well. I help buy ebooks, so I'm intimately aware of the licensing restrictions. When you were saying we libraries should contact the publishers to let them know that it's not really feasible what they're doing to some of the licenses, I actually tried that. I contacted Simon & Schuster. I met a rep from Simon & Schuster. They have one of the worst licenses, 1 year, and then you have to buy again. And she had no idea what I was talking about, and she said, "Oh, send me an email." I did that. Absolute silence. So it'd be great to be able to have a conversation with publishers. Do they know about this study? Do they care? How can we as a library profession get the changes made?
Really good and important question. And one of the reasons why we're working in particular with library associations, the bigger library associations, to raise this at the policy level and in the right meetings. So we've been at a number of meetings with IFLA. We know that we're hoping to have some future meetings with them around the research. NSLA is involved in the project too, and I guess it would be our hope. Certainly it would be possible for any public library to look at our data and look at specifics and, think about the impact of that. Remembering that our data is now from 2017, so you can't actually apply it directly to the current negotiations, but it gives you a sense of some of those differences. But as I say, our hope would be that the conversation is at the level of, say, IFLA and publishers associations in those bigger forums. And that's where we're trying to make sure that we're, getting in the room and talking about the research and making sure they know about it and then talking at that level. So hopefully that makes an impact at a bigger level because, like you, I wouldn't expect an individual library to be able to negotiate any of this stuff.
Hi, I'm Ashley from Wollongong Library. I have a lot of friends who use services like Audible. They're accessing these online resources, and I'm that annoying librarian at every party that goes, "Why are you not accessing it through your library for free?" Do you think that there's a place for libraries to come together, maybe level or somewhere further, to work on promoting the services in a similar way that Audible has done with those silly songs and because
and Rebel Wilson.
Yeah. Because it just seems like I think it's absolutely absurd that often the people who are accessing these paid services would be members of their libraries, or they probably don't have the money to be spending on purchasing these titles that we have access to, that we pay for them. But it just seems the message doesn't get out, except for annoying librarians at parties.
And annoying academics at parties, by the way.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe part of I know it's not completely linked to what you're looking at, but do you just have an opinion on whether maybe there should be some sort of, joint effort to get some advertising, to get some promotion out that doesn't rely on people having access to library social media or library websites to know what we offer?
Look, that's a really interesting question. The first response I would say on the basis of the data that we do have is that people are using e-lending, right? On average, we were seeing ebooks being borrowed 6 times a year. That's not negligible. It's maybe not as high as you'd hope, but it's not nothing. And if you look at the overall figures that Overdrive publish, for example, like millions and millions and millions of loans globally. So don't be too discouraged. Yeah.
Can I just say, one of those people that I yelled at was my partner. I didn't realise he'd signed up to Audible. And I'm like, why are you paying for things that we could get for free? How do you not know? So it's just the knowledge isn't there. And he got a big slap over the wrist for paying for books.
Good to hear. Look, but I think your basic question of whether we need to make sure that we're promoting that, or whether rather libraries need to make sure that they're promoting it and find better ways to promote it, is an absolutely valid point. And all I can say is, as an academic and someone who uses these services, is I wish more people did use them. I hope that more people will use them, and I tell people about them. But your point about promotion is an interesting one that I'll certainly raise with our library partners, including, as I say, the various associations like NSLA and IFLA and the big state libraries, as something that came out of this forum, something for them to think about. yeah, we're in regular communication with all of these organisations because we send them annoying emails about, look, we've got some new stuff for you to look at. So I'll certainly raise anything that comes up in the questions or comments here with them.
I also and what your study there is just I've heard that they do get
yes.
libraries. I don't know how. What is the potential?
Of course, of course. Look, no, these are really important questions. So, without giving you a whole lesson in the public lending right, the basic position is we have a public lending right. It's actually quite outside of the copyright system. It's administered by the Commonwealth Government, and the money for it comes from general revenue. So it's basically a Australian government investment in Australian authors only. It doesn't go to international authors. And effectively it reflects holdings in public libraries of books by Australian authors who've registered as Australian authors to receive payment. And once they get above a certain number of their books being held, they receive payment, and then beyond that it's kind of proportional to how many of their books are held in public libraries. And it was designed specifically to, in effect, compensate authors for the fact that their books are held in public libraries. That might eat into their sales, but in any event, they're held in public libraries. That means that we believe, as a society, that they're making an important contribution to our culture and they deserve to be rewarded for that. How do they know to register?
How do they know to register, and also how is it?
I can help.
Actually,
I can help because I'm an Australian author.
Thank you.
I'm going to defer to the greater expertise in the room at this point.
I don't have a tremendous amount of expertise in this. I knew because my publisher told me to, and very firmly, do it or I'll thank you. Not in a weird way. Well, no, it's all weird, and so that was it. So
the Australian Society of Authors also publicises it. Copyright Agency publicises it.
I've mentioned it to a couple of friends who are writers, and they're like, "Oh, okay, great." So I don't know that it's as rigorously policed in terms of you should do this. It doesn't happen automatically. I have to fill out forms, and then when a new book comes out, I'm like, "Oh, I have to write that."
What about the items being held?
That's Ellen's.
I can answer that one.
Good.
What happens is libraries get lists to check, and they physically, you get a, last time I did it was a printout, you probably get them electronically these days, and you check what's in your catalogue, and then that goes back. I don't think it's every library every year, it's a sampling
It's
method.
a survey sampling method,
So you might never have had to do the physical checking. It's super exciting to have to do it, but it's in a good cause, so super exciting is fine. So I also think that also goes back to you've actually had to list the title. Now this is a non-discrimination area for particularly authors of romance fiction. If you're an Australian author of Mills and Boon, for example, and your library doesn't add that your author title, you are depriving that person of their public lending right payment. Seriously. So think about this when you're not putting an author title for anything, because you are actually depriving an author of their public lending right payment. That's not a nice thing to do. When you're a library and you're not being fair to authors, that's not a good deed. So there could be other areas, but think about it. Who has some, no, actually I won't do a hands, that's a name and shame. Go back to your library and look if you have some material that is just a paperback, just a generic classification. If that's an Australian author, repeat what I said earlier, you are depriving them of public lending right funding. You are genuinely hitting their capacity to continue as an author. Fantastic.
And a fair rant too. It is very important. Your second question was around the electronic books and how this might impact.
It's been great.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you. That's great. There's a genuine debate about how, in particular, I mean, I don't think anyone would deny that authors deserve to be remunerated when their books are held as ebooks. The question is how, and it's not at all straightforward, because the fact that libraries are kind of holding titles is different. We may not have as obvious a source of data on all of this, and there's questions too about how they're being remunerated from publishers. So in author contracts, if particularly older ones, ebooks should be treated as licenses, which means a different royalty rate would apply. We need more information about whether that is in fact true, whether authors are in fact receiving income from their ebooks under appropriate royalty rates, what that means for, whether we're trying to compensate them twice or, it's actually quite a complex question. I mean, that is one of the reasons why we've got a PhD student to actually look at this in some proper detail with some proper data so that we can properly inform that debate and move it forward for the benefit of Australian authors. I'm really excited about that.
Questions?
I think we were pretty much out of time in any event, weren't we? The little signs down here were saying I'm down to 2 minutes or 1 minute or something.
I think that was a really fabulous session and very informative, and it was great to have the detailed answers to questions too. I think that was really helpful. Please join me in thanking Kimberly.
As well, can I just say one thing, which is I have some copies of a little brochure we did on some of the research that summarises some of it. So if any of you want to come and grab a copy from me of that, it's written in accessible form. It's not a scholarly article. Come and grab one from me.
Now, I'm going to hand over to Amy Heap, who will be chairing the rest of the morning. Amy is from Riverina Regional Library, although I might hover here in case technical support is needed for a moment, isn't it?
10 minutes stretch.
Oh, yes, okay, sorry. How did I miss that one? Okay, now, this is where you stand and stretch so that you're not sitting more than 2 hours in these seats because they're only so exciting. But this is not just a stand and random stretch. This is stand and share an idea from this session with someone near you. And then Amy will be continuing chairing after this.
Nice. I also really like to see the logo. Is it awesome? Do you know what it's called? It's very neat. That's, it's as opposed to like really interesting topics. Like your little thing. Well, there might be a number of students. You, by the way, On Twitter. Hello. Yes. Great. Okay, everybody, that was 10 minutes. If you could please take a seat again. Get started with the next session. So as Ellen said, I am Amy Heath, work for the Riverina Regional Library, and it is my great pleasure now to introduce Daniel O'Malley. So we're getting to the science fiction part of our science fiction themed day. So Daniel has written 2 novels. They're called The Rook and Stiletto, and in 2012 The Rook won the Aurealis Award for Best Science Fiction. I read them both in 2016. I read about 100 books a year, and they were my top 2 reads for the year. So I am most pleased to be able to introduce him to you now. He is an Australian author, but he doesn't sound like it. Please welcome Daniel O'Malley.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I can see the picture thing. So now I'm like, oh yeah, it's good. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. It is. Oh, my mom called me today and was like, no, you put your watch down on the podium and don't go over because these are librarians and they will shush you when you hit the deadline. I was like, oh, Christ, all right, but terrific. Anyway, thank you so much. It is a real, genuine pleasure to be here today. Librarians are, of course, the best people in the world. Yeah, I've known this since I was 6, when the librarian at Woden Public Library
allowed me to take home 4 Asterix books instead of the usual maximum permitted 2 at that point in my life. It was the greatest thing ever to happen to me, and I've never forgotten it, which is why one of the main characters in the novel I'm working on at the moment is a librarian, and I can assure you she kicks ass and controls lightning. And it's an especial delight to come and talk about science fiction with you because it's a genre that's brought me a great deal of pleasure and inspiration in my life. Even though I really don't care about science at all. My first job in high school was as an explainer, a guide at the National Science and Technology Centre in Canberra. And I couldn't tell you anything now about any of the exhibits. I pushed the button that made the caged lightning go, and I had a canned speech about lightning that I gave, and which I don't remember. That's all the science I have. You know, I could tell you the good gossip about the guides who were caught making out on the earthquake simulator. But that anecdote, while amusing and probably not, maybe even educational, sort of, isn't really very scientific. Well, maybe biology. But all this is by way of saying that one doesn't have to know science or even like science in order to enjoy science fiction. I don't hate science, by the way. I'm just glad that other people are there to take care of it for me, drugs and machines and so on. But I thought that I would talk about why I enjoy science fiction and why some people find science fiction problematic and what I enjoy about writing science fiction. I'd also like to tell you about my favorite subgenre of science fiction and name some books that I particularly enjoy and which I think you and your patrons might enjoy because I like them so much. So science fiction can be a little tricky, as you would know. My first novel, The Rook, which you mentioned, it won the Aurealis Award for Best Science Fiction Novel, which was tremendously exciting and encouraging. And in the spin of accepting the award and giving a slightly rambling thank you speech and being congratulated and smiling dopily at the world, I was called over to speak to a bearded gentleman with a microphone. It could have been for radio, it could have been for a podcast. I don't think I was ever clear on that. But I'll never forget the question that he asked, which was, so, you've won the award for Best Science Fiction, but your book isn't science fiction, so would you like to comment on that? I'm like, it's a difficult question to spring on anyone, especially someone who's, just had a few celebratory glasses of champagne on an empty stomach. And look, at that moment, it really seemed entirely possible that if I didn't come up with a very good thing to say at that moment, literary guards were going to appear and tase me to the floor and take away the award. And look, to be fair, which I don't normally really like to do, the bearded man with the microphone had something of a point. Because The Rook, which is the book, it begins with a woman waking up in a London park, and she has lost her memories, and she's surrounded by dead bodies, and in her pocket she finds a letter saying, "Dear you, the body you are wearing is mine. I knew this would happen. I've made preparations. Go here, do this, be careful, you have enemies." And it turns out this woman, whose name is Miffany, which is the incorrect pronunciation of the name of the little girl I used to babysit across the street. That's how she said it. That's how I understood it to be. This character, and so I named it after her. She works for the British government agency, which deals with and is staffed by the supernatural. So she has the power to control people's bodies. Her boss can enter people's dreams. Her co-worker has 4 bodies with 1 mind controlling them. They fight monsters and fill out forms. And I never give an explanation as to why the world of the Rook is like this, why there are people like this. It's just the case in my book, which means apparently that the Rook is fantasy rather than science fiction. As a result, this bearded guy with a microphone was asking me this. And fortunately for me, on that evening, asked a question which had never occurred to me, and which could easily make me look like an idiot. The Rook also has a group of villains. Evil Belgians. They are the grafters, scientists who can twist the genetics of living things to make them as they wish, to take on new forms and whatnot. How they manage it, I don't ever actually know. I don't give the mechanics of it. I have only a basic understanding of genetics and enough knowledge of anatomy that I can walk around and eat and not kill myself. And that's about it. But there is an explanation as to why the grafters can do what they do. And that answer is science. It's science. They do it scientifically. And by saying science, it means they're science fiction, and I sort of sounded reasonable on the radio to that guy, or the podcast, whatever it was. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there is a goodly amount of science fiction in my books, despite myself. Even though my books are generally categorized as urban fantasy or genre bending, which really means that the person writing the description is not entirely certain what the hell they are. Or, as I like to describe the books to people in Canberra, they're supernatural thrillers set in the public service, because public servants are always so delighted that they've been acknowledged. But I have a lot of characters and situations which are, quite frankly, inexplicable. There's no way science can explain them. The man made out of silk, the dragon that hatches and then proceeds to eat the precocious young man who's claimed a special bond with it, the woman who produces spectral South American animals that run wild through the downtown area of Liverpool. They're frightening and they're entertaining, for me at least, because they could never happen. They're the fantasy. But the science fiction elements, the woman who has a mobile phone implanted in her brain, the computer that decides to eat the internet, the people who conduct surgery on themselves for no other reason than it's a Tuesday and they're bored, those count as science fiction because they're at least slightly plausible. Slightly. And I guess it's that little bit of plausibility, that little nagging thought of, that could happen, that could actually be a thing, that gives science fiction its extra kick for me when I'm writing. With fantasy, when I talk to people, it's, well, that could never happen. How could you think of that? And with science fiction, it seems like, it seems like that could happen. I wonder, geez. So The Rook and the sequel, Stiletto, they're in some ways about science fiction and fantasy, butting heads and regarding each other with a certain amount of fixed horror. I enjoy both genres a lot, actually. I pretty much enjoy all genres of fiction. I'm kind of a whore in that regard. But obviously, since I apparently write them, I have a special affection for sci-fi and for fantasy. And I always sort of think of them as Batman and Superman, in their most fanciful, their most extreme. They represent the greatest we can aspire to, the big ideas that could happen, and the greatest things we can imagine, the things that can only live in our heads. But science fiction and fantasy are usually thrown together, at least on the shelves in the shops, and often when people are talking about them. You really could easily think it was just a single term, science fiction fantasy. And it's a fair pairing. Both deal with things that aren't actually real. Not yet, anyway. Both often feature people with names that have an overabundance of vowels and apostrophes. Both have an unfortunate cultural history of portraying women in bikinis. They might be fur bikinis or chainmail bikinis or silver bikinis with bubble helmets, but the bikinis are there. And the two genres are so often paired together that I think it's worth, for my entertainment, if nothing else, taking a few moments to exploring the difference between them, especially because even though they get sat together on shelves and at parties, there's often some headbutting between them. I have friends who adore fantasy, but really shun science fiction, and vice versa. And I think it comes down to various assumptions and expectations that are commonly held about each genre. So here are some opinions that I got from people and that I thought of myself. Science fiction's in the future, or at least a very creepy present. Fantasy is set in the medieval period. Science fiction is robots, spaceships, aliens, and all too often it's white men saving the future. Fantasy is horses, dwarves, castles, and really all too often white men saving the past. Fantasy is romantic. Science fiction is geeky. Science fiction is presumed to have flush toilets. In fantasy, no one ever goes to the toilet. So it's not really important what kind of toilet they use, but you can probably assume that it's not particularly nice, even if they live in a palace. Science fiction is Star Trek. A lot of people tell me that. Fantasy used to be Lord of the Rings. It's currently Game of Thrones. And of course, all these generalizations are far more rigid than is actually the case, as you would know. Although really, I think if I have any literary insight, it's that the toilet thing is completely spot on. That's really the line between science fiction and fantasy, is flush toilets. And for so many people, they assume science fiction is entirely what it was in the middle part of the 20th century.
They think of it as Isaac Asimov or Frank Herbert's Dune series, or maybe Jules Verne if they're feeling really literary. They think of it as stories about white men, often in space, having very technically detailed adventures. And I mean, those types of stories do exist, certainly, and they mean a lot to a lot of people. But really, that description, I think, is tremendously unfair, even to those three writers I mentioned, because Isaac Asimov wrote a metric ton of very amusing and amazing non-science fiction stuff. I mean, seriously, the man was terrifyingly prolific. And Frank Herbert's work, extremely technically detailed, but really it focuses as much on the thoughts and actions and lives of people in the future as it does on their powers and their technology. And I mean, God, Jules Verne, the man produced material so varied and so clever and so appealing and so popular. I mean, he's actually literally inspired generations of scientists and adventurers and writers over 3 different centuries. But those are handy cliches, really. They've had such an effect that they still linger in a lot of people's minds. But time goes on. More people write stories, and so many different people now write different kinds of science fiction, bringing their own desires and their own preferences and voices to their work, that I would argue that now science fiction is all genres. Every genre. For those of you who might be wary of approaching science fiction or of recommending it, I think this fact, if nothing else, might be useful to you, might be helpful to you. Whatever genre a reader loves, there will be a science fiction version of that. Romance, comedy, horror, historical, pastoral even. I was really startled to discover that one of my favorite books ever, The Hilarious and Cutting Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons. You should all read it. It was published in 1932. And if you haven't already read it, please do. It mercilessly and hilariously skewers the romanticized rural fiction of its day, but it's actually science fiction, much to my astonishment. In between the story of a modern young woman coming to the country and briskly solving her gloomy country relations problems, there are details tucked away in it that actually make it science fiction. There's TV phones and sky taxis and references to the Anglo-Nicaraguan Wars of 1946. I only read that book about 4 times before I picked up on it, and I'm really not sure if my mom, who put the book into my hands, was ever aware of it. But it is science fiction. Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons. And there's also a good movie with Kate Bosworth, which is also really good. But if you want to know more about science fiction, or if your patrons, which is, I thought the speech earlier saying, you have readers and you have visitors, I thought that was very nice. I always understood it to be the patrons of the library, but those are good too. If they're interested in being guided towards science fiction works, then I recommend really looking at what you already like, or what they already like in terms of fiction, because for every taste, there will be a science fiction book that encompasses that. So for fans of horror, say, there really is no more frightening a villain in fiction than Quinn Dexter. He's in Peter F. Hamilton's Reality Dysfunction. And God, that character makes the book absolutely terrifying, even before the dead people start coming back in the future. Hamilton's books are very large, but actually when it's 1 a.m. and you can't really put the book down because you're that frightened, it's nice to have a really big, thick, heavy-made weapon, right in your hand, just in case the space undead comes scratching at the window. Stephen King's books are often science fiction. The Horror of Firestarter, The Dead Zone, The Running Man, there's an explanation for what's going on there, and I would argue that makes them science fiction as much as anything else. For comedy in science fiction, Jasper Fforde, Shades of Grey, his Shades of Grey, it's no relation to 50 Shades. That really has as much classic British whimsy as you could want, and only eventually will you realize that everyone in the story is actually not human, and that they're living a very polite and genteel life in the ruins of our own civilization. I'm partway through his latest book, Early Risers, and so far it's science fiction. In the course of reading Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time, I really found myself being more concerned about the fate of individual fictional spiders than I have been since reading Charlotte's Web.
I'm not certain that you guys have many readers who are specifically looking for books about individual spiders, but it's such a good book that I wanted to mention it to you guys. So I urge you to keep in mind that science fiction isn't necessarily what you think it is or what your patrons and readers and guests might think it is. You may have read it already and enjoyed it and foisted it upon your readers without realizing what it was. In preparing to talk to you all about science fiction, I enacted the same research protocol I use for so many things. It's the way I get an answer to the question of what would happen to a building if one of its supporting walls was suddenly turned to jelly. This is what I do for my research for my books. It's how I found out what head lice smell like. It's how I find out which parts of a human corpse would be the most beneficial for a tree. It's what you do when you have a question at 11 p.m. at night and the libraries are closed. I put out a question on social media. I ask my friends and relations, those who don't read science fiction, to tell me why they didn't. Inevitably, many friends who do read science fiction felt compelled to comment, thanks, social media. But I did get quite a few helpful responses, and quite a few of them were the same. Many of my friends wanted to read about people and situations that they could relate to, by which they meant people-focused, not too firmly divorced from reality as we know it. No space empires, no weird planets. One of the books I always recommend, regardless of whether someone's looking to read science fiction or not, sorry, my watch is sliding down, is William Gibson's Pattern Recognition. I don't know if it's science fiction. William Gibson, of course, is a very important science fiction writer. He wrote Neuromancer and its sequels. He actually coined the term cyberspace. And really, he helped to create the cyberpunk genre, which for many people boils down to grim people in sunglasses, walking around under neon, doing internet things, and frequently cutting each other to ribbons. I enjoy the genre. Think The Matrix, Blade Runner, Altered Carbon. Pattern Recognition is not that. It's set about a year after 9/11. It's about a woman who has an almost allergic reaction to trademarks. She uses it as a sixth sense to discern what will be cool, what will be popular, and she works for PR firms and design firms, and she is hired by a PR firm to track down the origin of a series of film clips, silent, artistic film clips, which are placed all around the internet. It's a very beautiful book. It's told in an almost dreamy way, and it deals with technology, but it also deals with a woman who is mourning the loss of her father in the 9/11 attacks. She has no definite answer about her father's fate, and it's about how she finds a lot of answers and a lot of meaning. I went speed dating at the National Library once. It was an event. I wanted to meet some ladies, and we were told to bring a book to talk about as an icebreaker, and I brought Pattern Recognition, and I the most dates out of all the dudes, and I give Pattern Recognition at least partial credit for that, because it may be science fiction, but it's science fiction not too firmly divorced from reality, and it's science fiction that people want to read. I don't know if it's science fiction, but I think it is. From what I understand, everything mentioned in that book and in its sequels, Spook Country and Zero History, the interesting technology and the big ideas, those all exist, or at least they're entirely possible. It's not fictional science. The books talk about technology, but it's not alien. It's cool. It shows how cool the world is. And I think the writing in that book is such that if you like it, you like his other works, and his other works are science fiction. Some of them are easier to read than others. William Gibson, doesn't necessarily explain his worlds in a clear way, but I think it's really worth reflecting that people usually write science fiction because they want to write about things they think are cool. They want to write about ideas that excite them, which brings me to another point that some of my friends brought up. They don't want to have to deal with trying to memorize how a whole new world or several new worlds work. They don't want to have to spend time having to learn how everything works, all the technology. And as one of them said, real life is drama enough. And I was like, yeah, but you watch Game of Thrones religiously, and that's, it can't just be for the topless gentleman. Many readers don't want the work that comes with science fiction, which is fine. For a lot of people, as you know, for them, reading fiction is just about relaxation. And another sticking point is that many people tend to be wary of science fiction. They seem to feel as if they're going to be forced to take a test on it afterwards. They feel like they need to know science in order to understand it. And some of my favorite science fiction writers really like to show their work. The good ones will explain any science in such a way that you don't feel like an idiot. Neil Stephenson's, his books explained Google Earth to me before there was a Google Earth, and they left me with a pretty good understanding of how cryptography worked in World War II and how it works today, even though that's not anything I'm interested in, or at least I thought I wasn't interested in it. But even more crucially, he really left me wanting to learn more. Other friends have told me they don't want to have to invest a lot of time and effort in trying to remember who's related to what. I sort of already said that, but whatever. How the science fiction world works, why they should care about these people or robots or aliens or mutants with whom they have nothing in common and to whose problems they can't relate, which is fine. It kills a little part of me, the writer within me. And William Goldman once wrote, how could they pick reality over me? But I really do understand, Frank Herbert's Dunes books included multiple appendices describing the universe. It can be a lot of work. Yeah. I read a lot. I read on the bus. I read in queues. I've mastered the art of reading while walking, which makes me sort of a minor celebrity in the city center where I work. The key to reading while walking, by the way, is developing very good peripheral vision. You would periodically pause to monitor what's ahead for any significant obstacles. And I can proudly say that the only time I fell down a manhole in my life, I was not reading at the time. Although I did have an armful of library books. But I read. So I have the time to read, and people see me reading and they ask me for recommendations. And sometimes they ask a little nervously because, I'll read absolutely anything, and sometimes the covers are a little alien to them. But they still ask, and because I write science fiction, sort of, sometimes they'll ask me what I think they ought to read, like it's the homework, or here are the classics that if you want to be a good person, you should read them. As a gateway drug to science fiction, for those who aren't entirely certain that it's their cup of tea, I always recommend my favorite type of science fiction, which is time travel. It's sci-fi, but it's also historical fiction. I find that it ticks a lot of boxes in addressing some common concerns about science fiction. Time travel has to be about the people, which is something that I think people who are wary of science fiction will be reassured by. It has to be about the people. It has to be about their reactions and their thoughts. And I think it's a situation that, many people can imagine themselves in. We're brought up being educated about history. We watch historical movies. We wonder what it would be like if we went back to Downton Abbey. Naturally, we'd be living in the good rooms, not the servants' quarters. But we think about the past and how we do in it. And there tends to be a very little scientific explanation for these time travel books beyond the fact that, hey, we have a time machine. Let's use it. You don't have to do maintenance on it, just use it, and you're back in time. And in truth, time travel is a genre, a subgenre that really had a significant impact on my life. In high school, I read Doomsday Book by Connie Willis. It's genuinely beautiful. It's haunting. It's frightening. It takes place partially in a not-too-distant future Oxford and partially in England at the time of the Black Death. And it was one of the primary reasons that I studied medieval history in graduate school. Medieval history is not the most useful or practical field of study, but I enjoyed it a great deal. And really, I always have the delightful knowledge that if there was an abrupt time travel incident which transported me and everyone around me back to the medieval period, I'd do a lot better than most of them. Not in this case, you're all librarians, you'd be fine. But, most people, they'd be dead. And Connie Willis's next book in the series, To Say Nothing of the Dog, shows that science fiction can feature a good, entertaining romance and outstanding humor. It's set in Victorian England. It lovingly loops in Jerome K. Jerome's classic of humor, Three Men in a Boat, which is not science fiction, but which you should all read regardless anyway, because it's so good. If you love Three Men in a Boat, and you either do or you should, then I think you'll love To Say Nothing of the Dog. And Willis's subsequent time travel story. It's a two-parter set in the London of World War II. It has you caring so much about the characters and about the circumstances that once you start, you'll find yourself hiding in the stairwell at work to finish it. Not that I did that, because there's the online thing. The time travelers of Willis's time travel books, they're academics. They're not space warriors. They're history students. And they're very human, and they're more interested in the historical people in the fictional science. In so many ways, I think in science fiction, the technology, which many people find alarming, is really just to advance the story. It's not the point of the story. And if your patrons, if your guests, your readers are wary of Space Marines or Jedi, then I think this time travel series might be for them. And another interesting element of time travel, at least much of it, is that it's frequently the protagonists are not male, which, I mean, as we all know, can make a lot of difference. Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series, it's technically fantasy, I guess, since, hey, there's no scientific explanation for her being zapped back to old-timey Scotland, but it really shows how beloved a good time travel story can be, and by people who don't normally dig that kind of thing. And I think it's not just because of the cracking romance or that TV show with that really good-looking couple. Yeah, I heard the name. Yeah. Another good time travel series, one that I really love, is by Kage Baker, Kage Baker, Children of the Company. It follows a group of immortals, cyborgs, not demigods, so thus it's sci-fi, it's not fantasy, as they live through history. And one of the great hooks here is that they've come from the future, and they already know history, they know what's coming, and they bring a good modern sensibility to it. We see them in Tudor England, pre-colonial South America, pre-Hollywood California, and then on to the future. It's written very cleverly, entertainingly. It's beautifully researched, and the fact that the protagonists get high off chocolate makes for some really good scenes as well. Michael Crichton, his timeline book about history students traveling back to the medieval period. Well, you can imagine why I'm so pleased with it. He does show his work a bit. He has to come up with a plausible explanation as to the mechanics behind time travel, but I mean, one of Michael Crichton's special talents was always making, very terrifyingly dense topics quite digestible and popular. Look at Jurassic Park, after all. And the thing is that rarely does a time travel writer just do time travel. They write other things. And I think that once a reader has discovered they enjoy the voice of a writer and the ideas of a writer, they may be more open to other works by them. Really to carry on with my unfortunate, gateway drug metaphor, once they've gotten a taste for it, they're gonna move on to harder product. God, that really didn't sound so ominous when I wrote it. I was like, yeah, gateway drugs, harder. Oh no, this is why I should have got my editor to look at this. So the most recent time travel book I read, yeah, I wrote, but I read it, is by one of my favorite writers, and I mentioned him before. He writes sci-fi, among other things, and if you ever need to recommend science fiction to anyone, or if you want to try science fiction, then I don't think you can do better than Neil Stephenson. Some people are nodding. His time travel book, The Rise and Fall of DODO, tells how a government department is hastily pulled together to explore time travel. And it begins enlisting women throughout history who can send operatives back and forth through time. Witches, basically. They identify as witches. So it's magic. Fantasy? Except that he gives an explanation that fits, sort of, with accepted scientific principles. Neil Stephenson, he shows his work. But like Michael Crichton, he does it such that you're rarely confused. You're actually entertained. He writes cleverly. He writes funnily. Funnily? Funnily is a word. He writes in a funny manner. No, he writes funny text. He writes snidely. He's written cyberpunk. He's written big idea science fiction. He knows his technology well. His Baroque cycle, it's set in the 17th century. And I don't know if it's science fiction. It's scientific. Isaac Newton's a major figure, but it's a picaresque. It follows rogues having adventures in the world. And I emerged from it knowing, despite myself, more about finance and calculus and life in the harem of the Ottoman Sultan. He covers all these things. And another book of his, Seven Eves, it's set pretty much now. And it scared the living hell out of me. And not just because the human race is reduced to 7 women, but it's great. He writes very well, and it's books that people who don't think they enjoy science fiction might really enjoy. So I think you can't go wrong, recommending and reading the books I've mentioned, partially because they're all great and partially because they're what I like. And, I'm correct. But not everyone likes the same books that I like. There are a lot of science fiction books based on popular properties. There's a whole library of Star Wars novels, multitudes of Star Trek novels. One of my friends is addicted to the Warhammer 40,000 series. That was inspired by that war game series that you play with miniature soldiers, but it's books that he enjoys reading. We're seeing more and more television shows and movies based on books, including sci-fi, including mine, which will be coming to Stan, I just found out this year. But there's also other science fiction works, Altered Carbon, Philip K. Dick's Electric Dreams. And if you're unsure of the book, try watching the show. See if it sparks your interest. Of course, there's no right thing to be reading. People will read what they're intrigued by, and their tastes will change, and they'll seek out new stuff, and they'll share their enthusiasms with you.
I mean, I think as this speech will have demonstrated, people really enjoy talking about their enthusiasms. Finally, some of the friends I asked about not reading science fiction, they seem kind of stressed by the question, a little defensive, like admitting to not liking it or not reading it was something they should be ashamed of, and as if they thought it was too hard for them, or they were letting the side down, like it was a chore they should be doing, or a test they should be studying up for, which is a little sad. I mean, there is no obligation to read science fiction, but it's not supposed to be a chore. It's not written to be a chore. It's supposed to be for pleasure, for stimulation. It's about ideas. It's written by people who are genuinely excited about their ideas, and that excitement usually comes across, I think, in the writing. So some of it's adventure, some of it's drama, some of it's humor, some of it's romance, some of it's complicated, and some of it is extremely simple. But I think it's a lot more varied than many people think, and I think that's the key to approaching it. So I hope you find that useful. I probably talked really fast, but I don't normally do a lot of talking, and I use that web thing where it says this number of words equals this number of minutes, and I think it was pretty spot on. So if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them about anything, but thank you. Gosh, sorry. Yeah, any questions, please. Oh, thank God. Oh my gosh.
You can always count on me to ask questions.
Bless you.
I am one of those people that gets really guilty when people say, why don't you read sci-fi or fantasy? One of the biggest issues I have is exactly what you said should be the gateway. I can't understand time travel. I've read The Prisoner of Azkaban 4 times and watched the movie 3 times and then went, oh, that's what she's doing with the
You do feel like you should be keeping a diagram. Okay, now they're back here.
Do you have any advice? Because I'm also disowned from a lot of my family because I don't watch Doctor Who. Things
Oh, okay.
like that.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people who have a struggle with the suspension of disbelief and also trying to figure out what the hell is happening when it comes to time travel?
Ooh. I think for most time travel, I mean, Prisoner of Azkaban is a very complicated one because they're constantly zipping back and forth. The ones I recommended, because they're the best and because I'm the best, are usually quite simple insofar as people just go back in time and then have to live it. People get excited by the idea of time travel, like, okay, well, then you can meet yourself and you can do this and you can do that. But I think for a lot of cases, it's just a case of, I want to see how modern people might react in the past. So I really recommend Connie Willis's stuff because they get submerged in it. And so it's really more about living or experiencing that adventure, if that makes sense. Is that sort of helpful? Right?
And it's also okay if time travel is not your thing.
Yes, lots of people don't like what I like, and they're probably okay. They're probably all right people, I guess. Yeah. Oh, yes, hi.
Hello, I'm Kylie from Port Macquarie.
Hi, Kate.
Hi. My question is that in recent years, I feel like the genre in teen.
Yes.
And I just wonder how do you see that fitting in with your sci-fi or fantasy? Do you have any recommendations?
Oh, sure. I mean, so for young adults or for anybody, yeah. I mean, it is a tremendously popular genre, and I think, I mean, as a youth, I really enjoyed it because the idea was, well, man, I'll get to be in command. I'll get to be in control. It's it's the cozy apocalypse where, or not, maybe not so cozy, but you can go into the shops and take what you want, and there's no parents to tell you what to do. And there were so many when I was young, and there's so many now. And dystopia, it obviously runs the gamut from, it's the blasted post-apocalyptic world through to it's just kind of unpleasant to be free. Scott Westerfeld has written some very popular ones. There's a series, Uglies, Pretties. Was it Pretties, Uglies? The Adjectives. And he writes very well for young adult and youth, and also never feels like he's pandering to them or trying to shoehorn the issue in so that he'll be on the HSC reading list. I actually just read a really great comic series, but they're available, of course, in the trade paperbacks by Greg Rucka, Rucka. It's the Lazarus series, and this I would say is maybe more for adults, but kids, whatever, who knows how they go. If they're emotionally scarred, don't blame me. And it's set in a future in which family corporations have taken over parts of the world. all of the world, so it's all divided. It's very, very good, and the main protagonist is a woman who kicks ass, which I think is very important to feature. Michael Grant's books, the Gone series, I read within a week, all of them. I mean, I got no work done, but that's fine. They're very absorbing. They are pretty. There's a warning on the front. There's violence and cruelty in them, but they're terrifically absorbing. Other dystopias. I was like, tell me something. No, but I'm supposed to be answering. Those are the ones that jump immediately to mind. There's so many dystopias out there, and some of them can be pretty frightening. Children of the Dust scarred me for life. It's very realistic nuclear apocalypse, and Children of Morrow. It's always children of the future dealing with stuff. Yeah, I'm sorry, you had your hand up. Did you have a suggestion or is it a question? Okay, cool. It was just like stop talking about dystopias, but they're very popular as you've marked. There's a lot out, and they've been out there are a lot of them. But I hope those ones are helpful.
Hi, Daniel. My name is Lynn from the City of Canada Bay. I just want to say that I've been running a fantasy and science fiction book group for about 10 years.
Oh, great!
And when we read The Rook. It was voted the most popular book that year, so I just wanted to
thank you so much. That's really encouraging.
So it's a multiple part question. First one is what's the title of your next book?
Working title. Oh, I've never announced it, but I'll tell you guys because it's only the internet. I'm sure we'll go. Working title is Take Flight, and I'm nearly done. But
book 3?
Yes, but same government department, but different elements. Yeah.
And this is a follow-up question. Have you read James Corey, Leviathan Wakes?
No, should I?
TV series The Expanse.
Oh, I haven't. I think I read the first one, and I mean to, but yeah, they're great. They're very popular, and I have nothing to say. Sorry, I haven't. I've read the first book. I haven't seen the show. But I mean to. Oh, thank God. We're so petrified. They'll be like, no, talk.
Hi, I'm Lauren.
Hey.
I wanted to ask you about your books and about how you plot them out because, that there's the woman has lost her memories. And then there's also some quite convoluted plotting, I imagine, around the character of Gestalt.
Yes. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Gestalt, I mentioned it briefly, I think. Gestalt, just people really like that character. It's 4 siblings, 4 bodies, and they share one mind. And so it's a lady, identical twins, and a dude. And so you always have to remember that when you're talking to the one character, to the one body, it's all of them sharing a mind. And they're in the TV show, because I went and got shot a cameo at the TV show, but also it's in the trailer, the Rook trailer. It's available now on YouTube. And they're very striking, these 4 blondes walking around doing creepy things together. And that came to me because I was helping a friend move house, 5 minutes, and I really hate manual labor, and we were moving a couch down the stairs, and I was like, God, turn left, Jesus. And then if I had multiple bodies, this would be so, Jesus, put the couch down, I have to write this down. And they were like, what? And I'm like, it's fine, we'll keep moving. I just have to keep repeating multiple bodies, just, don't be distracted. For plotting, it varies. The plot for the book I'm working on at the moment came to me almost completely, the big details, while I was waiting in line at a Subway sandwich shop. And I was like, World War II would be, oh my God, I'll have a tuna sub and a piece of paper and a pen because, I got to write this down. The Rook, which opens with this woman waking up in the park, I had no idea where it was going to go. Everything I wrote asked more questions that I then had to answer. And I thought, well, that's done. That happened. That's great. Stiletto came because I was like, wait, I thought I'd wrapped everything up, but in fact I've left everybody with a huge mess to address. What are the issues? And also, luckily, because my day job is in the public service, they were doing a machinery government thing and merging these departments, and everybody was ready to kill each other. And so I'm like, this is fantastic. I'll just take notes. This is brilliant. And people would be like, oh, do you know what happened today? I'm like, no, what? Like, it was the worst day of my life. I'm like, fantastic. I'll change the race and the gender, but brilliant. Yeah. So it varies. How do I have 3 minutes, right? Yes. Oh, sorry. I feel like you have 1 minute. No, but yeah.
Hi, I'm Amanda.
Get out of here.
Does anybody know?
Okay, so we like to talk about, we're now addressing themes.
Oh, great.
So
Yeah.
It's people speak, not librarians speak.
Mm.
So what type of themes, and maybe even what kind of genre is really unique to Australia that we should be considering? I just learned about chooklit.
I'm not familiar with chooklit. Is it rural romance? Oh, that's so sexist of me, but is it?
So
You were like, yeah, but it is.
So as we are working with Australia, it is really helpful to us to find out how can we better connect with the readers. So I figure you are the sci-fi guy at the moment. So what do you think? And you can use sci-fi guy.
Okay. Wait. So you're looking for like what themes are in Australian fiction?
What would be
Mm-hmm.
what you feel would be relatable. So if someone is searching for their next great read, they just finished one of your books.
Oh.
Or they have finished another sci-fi and they really want to connect to that Australian element of.
Well, my book is set in London, so it's less helpful. So I don't. I mean, I do. Okay, let's go with that then. I mean, I can always recommend more books, and I can always recommend more Australian authors. But is that what you're really looking for? I mean, nobody writes like me. He says they have better taste. Everyone is more sensible. So I would point, if you're interested in like supernatural law enforcement, then to my horror, there's another series. Ben Aronovich writes the Rivers of London series, and they're so good. But when I first heard about it, I was like, magical law enforcement in London. I was ready to open a vein in Dimmicks. But luckily, he does the police, and it's sufficiently different that I didn't have to weep quietly in the science fiction fantasy section. Yeah, I mean, and the problem is that it's hard to define. So that was one of the issues when they were looking to publish my book was. Well, it straddles the genres. It's urban fantasy, but it's also humor, and it's also action, it's also horror. Thank God for Jasper Fforde in that regard, because he really set a very important precedent for good adventure. Oh, somebody has a question? 2 people have a question, and we have like a minute, so we've got to be super quick, otherwise I'll get the shushing. It's just shushed by a billion librarians would be great.
Sorry,
yeah.
Tarot from Parramatta here. I actually don't have a question, but we've had.
Oh, okay.
Title, she's got a trilogy. I don't think she has a lot of aim, and it doesn't say it's set in Australia, but it's kind of, you can tell.
Fantastic.
It doesn't mention the city, but it mentions outback and stuff like that.
Okay, terrific. Did you get it? All right. Solari Gentle writes murder mysteries set in the 1930s Australia, and I'm not just recommending her because she's a friend. Solari Gentle, Gentill. And Karen Viggers, who is also somebody I know. My mom was tutoring her kid in writing, and Karen is a veterinarian as well as a writer of beautiful books exploring the Australian landscape. And she was like, it's like, my mom will tutor your kid in essay writing for free. And she's like, couldn't possibly be for free. And I was like, well, you're a veterinarian. And she's like, yeah. I'm like, well, you could also, in exchange for writing tutoring, you can take care of my dog's anal glands. And she's like, wouldn't you rather have money? And we're like, no, the glands. Yeah. I think I'm almost out of time. Probably. Oh, okay. One more.
Just sort of Robert from Lithgow Library.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you've read Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee.
Yes. I didn't even think to mention it. Oh,
one
yes.
of the earliest examples of time travel.
Yeah. Oh, it might be. It's certainly the earliest I can think of. God, it's great. He's such a snot, Mark Twain. I love his work. He's so snide and unkind. Exactly like what I look for. I'm totally out of time, but thank you so much. It was really great talking to you, and I hope it was mildly useful.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was more than mildly useful.